Hello everyone, I am FIDE instructor and Arena International Master Rishikesh Chavan. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today in Chess Made Simple, we are going to learn pawn weaknesses. Pawn weakness is a permanent weakness. Once you have a pawn weakness, it is very difficult to get rid of the weakness. So let's see how many pawn weaknesses are there. The first pawn weakness is isolated pawn. The meaning of isolated pawn is a pawn which is not defended by any other pawn. So that means if there are no same color pawn on its neighboring files, then we can say the pawn is weak. In this position, black's C pawn is an isolated pawn, whereas white's G pawn is an isolated pawn because there is no white color pawn or there is no same color pawn on its neighboring files. So in such cases, whenever such pawn is under attack, all the defending has to be done with the pieces, and that way the position can convert to very defensive one, and maybe we can even lose the pawn. Now there is one big difference between both these isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are also called as isolanids. So black's isolated pawn is on the open file, so that way white can easily attack the pawn. Let's assume white has a rook over here, so white can simply put his rook on the open file, rook c1, and then he can start his attack. Whereas white's isolated pawn is on the closed file, so that way it will take more efforts for black to attack this pawn. So you can keep this thing in mind. So whenever you are going for the exchanges, think about the possible pawn structure arising out of that exchange. Think whether that pawn structure is suitable for you or not. Think if you are getting any permanent pawn weakness, and if you are okay with all the future positions. If you think your future position will be fine, then you can go ahead and exchange the pieces. Let's move ahead. Okay. The second weakness is double pawns. The meaning of double pawns is very simple. Two pawns on one file, or two, you can say two same colored pawns on one file are called double pawns. So these are white's double pawns, whereas black's double pawns are on C file. Normally, double pawns are not always weak. So here we can say white's double pawns are weak, or we can say white double pawns are isolated double pawns. So they can be attacked easily, and that way white will have to do a lot of defending to save those pawns. On the other hand, black's double pawns are in a group, so this way we can say black's double pawns are good. So maybe white must have captured a knight over here, and then black played b into c6, and that way he got his extra pawn on c6. Now this extra pawn, or we can say double pawn, is giving some extra control of the center, and even the other pawn is there, and that way as you can see, lots of important squares are controlled by this group of pawns. So that way double pawns are not always weak. You have to foresee whether arising double pawns will be weak or strong. Let's move ahead. Okay, this is the position. So here white plays bishop into c6, b into c6, knight e2, bishop into f3, and g into f3. Now both the players have double pawns. So let's compare these double pawns. As you can see, both the double pawns are in a group, but not that doesn't mean they are good, or they are not weak. As we just discussed, this pawn structure or this formation of double pawns is good because this extra pawn is giving some extra control of the center. Also, this is a pawn chain. So normally, if you want to destroy the pawn chain, you have to attack on the base of the pawn chain, which is on c7. So once c7 pawn is gone, then the d6 pawn will be very weak, and once d6 pawn is gone, then the e5 pawn will be very weak. So this is the way you destroy pawn chain. Now this c6 pawn is giving extra cushion to this base of the pawn chain, which is c7 pawn. On the other hand, as you can see, white has this tiny pawn chain. These are the double pawns. Now if we compare these two pawns, then you will come to know that base of the pawn chain, that is f3 pawn, is not covered by the double pawns. In fact, it is in front of the other pawn. So that way this pawn structure of, or we can say white's pawn structure, is much more weaker than the black's pawn structure. Black's pawn structure is certainly not weak anymore. So again, you have to calculate well in advance before you exchange any pieces, and you have to imagine what pawn structure you are getting on the board, whether it's good for you to handle that weakness, or whether it will be a very important weakness or very crucial weakness where opponent can keep attacking, and then finally he will have upper hand in the game. Let's move ahead with the next position. Now the next pawn weakness is called a backward pawn. So here we can say this d6 pawn is a backward pawn. Meaning of the backward pawn is a pawn which is not supported by any pawn and which cannot be pushed ahead. So the pawn which cannot be pushed forward is called a backward pawn. So what white can do, white can line up his pieces against the backward pawn, and then one fine day this pawn will fall. Also, square in front of the backward pawn is also weak. So in this case, d5 square is also weak. As you can see, no black pawn has any control whatsoever on this d5 square. So that way, what white can do, white can put his pieces, white can set his pieces on this square, and he can start his attack. One very important thing, if your opponent has a backward pawn, so try to occupy the square in front of the backward pawn with the pieces and not with the pawns. For example, if you plant a knight over here, and if he captures, make sure you can recapture with some piece and not with the pawn, because if you capture with the pawn, then this weakness is gone. This d5 square is occupied by your pawn and you cannot do anything about it. Also, this backward pawn will be covered by your own pawn. This backward pawn is no longer on any open file. So try to occupy this square with your piece and try to recapture with a piece and not with a pawn. If you cannot recapture with any piece, then it's better just to move the piece away and then start protecting this square later on. Let's move ahead. This is Kalashnikov variation of Sicilian defense. Here the concept of backward pawn is employed. So this is the backward pawn, and white has planted his knight on d5. So as you can see, this knight is controlling lot of important square. There can be many forks coming up in the future. So black has to be very careful. Also, white is trying to launch a direct attack on this pawn. So maybe he will be playing queen d2, rook d1, and then one fine day he will capture the bishop and this pawn will fall. Also, he is trying to play knight to c2, and then maybe this knight will join the other knight on d5. So here white has kept this pawn under his control and he will slowly attack that pawn. Again, pawn's weakness is a permanent weakness, so you can take your time to attack that weakness. Don't play any rash move in a hurry, which will allow your opponent to cover his weakness or to get rid of his weakness. Let's move ahead. Okay. The fourth pawn weakness is pawn islands. So you know the meaning of island, right? It's a piece of land surrounded by water. So what is a pawn island? Pawn island is a pawn or a group of pawns separated by an open file. So here we can say black has three pawn islands, 1, 2, and 3, and all these pawn islands are separated by open files. On the other hand, white has two pawn islands, 1 and 2, and again these two pawn islands are separated by open files. Now, which is better, having more pawn islands or having less pawn islands? Let's see. Let's play few moves on the board. Now, after a few moves, as you can see, white had two pawn islands. That's why he has two base pawns. So white has to defend only two hanging pawns. The rest of the pawns are defended by some other pawn. So two pawn islands means two hanging pawns or two base pawns. On the other hand, black has three pawn islands. So that way he has three base pawns. So we can say black has three hanging pawns. So the more pawn islands you have, the more defending you will have to do. So that is why, again, before exchanging, consider all these points. These are the four weaknesses or four pawn weaknesses: isolated pawn, double pawns, backward pawn, and pawn island. Let's move ahead. Now there is a fifth type also, but it's not actually a weakness. This is called hanging pawns. So these two pawns on c5 and d5, these are hanging pawns. This kind of pawn structure is called hanging pawns. It has nothing to do with unsupported pawns. You must have used this word hanging a lot. So normally hanging means unsupported, but in this case hanging doesn't mean unsupported. There will be pieces behind the pawns to guard them. So hanging pawn structure arises out of Queen's Gambit decline variations. So if you are a d4 player, or if your opponent plays d4 and you are replying d4 with d5, then many times you may face this structure. Strength or weakness of such structure depends upon how the player handles it. So let's see whether this structure is good or bad. Now, because of these two advanced pawns, black has got extra control of these squares. So if he uses these extra squares correctly with his pieces, then we can say hanging pawns are better. Hanging pawns are good over here. But if he cannot use these extra squares well, he cannot utilize these squares with his pieces, then what white will do? White will line up his pieces, and then finally he will launch his attack against the pawns, and then one fine day the pawns will fall. So again, hanging pawns are not weak. It depends on the player how he handles it. If he can handle it better, then it's a strength. If he cannot handle the double pawns, then it will become a weakness, and opponent will make use of that. Let's move ahead. Now here we will try and create some pawn weaknesses. Right now position is totally equal, two minor pieces and seven pawns each. Here we are going to play c5. Now black must capture the pawn. If he just moves the knight away somewhere, maybe e2 or f3, then black will capture the pawn on b4, and that way black is getting one extra pawn. So he is forced to play this, and after bishop into pawn, now you can see suddenly there are two isolated pawns in white's position, and later on white will have to do a lot of defending to cover up these weaknesses. Let's move ahead. Here again material is equal, position is almost equal. There are two pawn islands, so black has these two pawn islands also, and white also has these two pawn islands. The only difference is number of pawns on each side. So on queen side black has 3, white has 2, and on the king side white has pawn majority, so it's 4 against 3. Now let's see how we can create a pawn weakness. So we are going to play knight d5 check. Now king must move to b7, or else the b6 pawn falls. King b7, and then we'll simply capture the bishop. Forced g into f6, and now as you can see, suddenly in two moves we have created a lot of weaknesses in opponent's position. There is this doubled isolated pawns. Also isolated pawn is over here, and as you can see there are 3 pawn islands compared to white's 2 pawn islands. So again black will have to do a lot of defending later on, and hopefully mostly white will keep attacking these weaknesses. Maybe he can exchange the rooks, and once the rooks are exchanged, then this f7 pawn will fall. If he defends the pawn with move like knight d8, then white will simply move his king towards the king side, and he will start capturing all these pawns one by one. So it's an easy win. It's a it's a long variation, but it is easy to calculate. Let's move ahead. Okay, let's see what we can do over here. The position looks totally calm, nothing is happening. Material is equal. Only difference is king is active compared to the other king. But here again we can create a pawn weakness. So we are going to play f5. Now this bishop is almost trapped, so black is forced to play bishop into bishop, and after pawn into c4, now suddenly the file is open, and now this backward pawn is on the open file. Few moves back, let's rewind moves. This pawn is still backward, but right now black is planning to push the pawn ahead so that his weakness will be gone. So we'll have to act quickly. We'll force him to exchange, and once this is done, now that pawn will be on the open file. There is no way black can defend that pawn on d6, and that way we have created a weakness successfully, and we are going to capture that weakness very soon. We'll end this topic with this interesting position. Let's see what is happening. Again, position is equal materially, or material is equal, two rooks and two minor pieces each. Again, seven pawns each. White's pawn structure looks bit better than black, because black has these two double pawns, but these double pawns are not weak because they are in a group, so they are doing wonderful job over here. So white has to do something to create a weakness in black's position. So we are going to play h5. Bishop is attacked, bishop has to move back, and then we will sacrifice a pawn. You can say temporary sacrifice, because we'll be getting that pawn back very soon with h6. Black is forced to capture the pawn. If he pushes the pawn ahead, then that way he will lose this pawn for free, and he will be pawned down. So that is why he has to capture. Now by sacrificing a pawn, we have created serious weaknesses in opponent's position. So there is this isolated pawn, then there are these doubled isolated pawns, and they are on the open file. So of course we are going to play bishop into f6 first. We got our sacrificed pawn back, but this weakness will be there for a long time. He is forced to play rook g8, and then we'll start attacking the weaknesses straight away by playing rook to h1. So now he will have to do a lot of defending. Maybe he will have to play passive moves like bishop f8, and then slowly we'll build up the pressure, and that way white can win this game. Again, it's a slow process. You can say it's a slow poison, but we have a definite advantage. We have a definite plan, and white is definitely going to win. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. So today we discussed a lot of pawn weaknesses. So we started with isolated pawn, then we discussed double pawns, backward pawn, pawn islands. We also discussed the strength and weaknesses of hanging pawn. So I hope you enjoyed the session. See you soon, everyone.